feel very aware that, for example, they can feel my touch, that they have a sort of, they're bending towards survival always and doing ingenious things to ensure that, not just survival, even flourishing. And when you recognize that in another being, it's just harder to disrespect them.
Aloha, I'm Robert Perkinson, director of the Better Tomorrow Speaker Series, which is a joint venture of the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Kamehameha Schools, the Learning Coalition, and Hawaii Community Foundation. And today our topic is maybe one of the grandest topics of all: organisms that constitute the greatest mass of life on Earth, organisms that are responsible for producing all of the oxygen we breathe and all of the sugars we consume and really are literally made of. Of course, I'm talking about plants, and our guest today argues that plants are too often taken for granted, but that if we delve into this parallel world of life, we will discover great things that will make us rethink everything. Zoë Schlanger is a staff writer at The Atlantic, an award-winning environmental and climate reporter, and she has a new book out, provocatively titled The Light Eaters: How the Unseen World of Plant Intelligence Offers a New Understanding of Life on Earth. And it is a book that is informative, lyrical, and surprising, and it's really just wonderful. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for that kind introduction.
It is really a very cool book.
Thank you.
You've devoted a big chapter of your life to plants now.
Yeah.
And that's not something most people do. So why?
Well, first of all, the superficial reason is that I love talking to botanists. They're some of the most fun people
Did you know that
to
before?
talk to. I didn't know that before.
Okay.
I had been working at a newsroom covering climate change and feeling kind of bleak about that topic after a while, and realized I had to cover something else. And it happened to be the same time as a fern genome was sequenced for the first time. And fern genomes are enormous. So this was a big deal.
That's why it was so late to be sequenced.
Exactly, very recently. This was maybe 2017, 2018. And I got this fern scientist on the phone to talk to him about it. And he was at a botany conference. And he said, do you want me to get a bunch more fern scientists on the phone? So he got a conference call going with like 7 fern researchers.
Wow.
And it was one of the most delightful conversations of my reporting career, because there was so much passion for plants coming from these researchers. You mentioned, why plants? Why focus on plants? Plants are not something many of us are raised to think of as being incredibly dynamic or active. They're kind of the backdrop to our world. But plant scientists know better. They recognize how vital plants are and how animated and active they are, and they have so much love for them. And it's an amazing thing to talk to scientists who feel love for their subjects.
That's great. You have the zeal of a new convert, but it's good to know that the old converts are still enthusiastic.
They're still going at it.
Part of the reason for that enthusiasm, I think, is just this new research that new methods and new measurement techniques and technologies are allowing that really are kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah.
All of the ways that plants are not inert or passive or boring, but that they're kind of like sentient and making what seem like decisions and exhibiting behaviors. And I thought we might go through some of those, because the book is just chock full of amazing stories of plants doing astonishing things. And what I didn't expect, I guess, is how much plants are sensing the world in almost all of the ways that we sense the world. Being extremely responsive, for example, to touch.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell us about plants.
Absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned this kind of new crop of research. Just to emphasize, this is all extremely new. In the last 10 or 15 years, there's been this revolution in botanical research that's rethinking this question of plants as behaving organisms that have sort of lifestyles of their own and exquisite capacities to sense the world. And one of those is touch. I was able to go to a lab in Wisconsin, the lab of Simon Gilroy, and he works with plants that have been modified to have a fluorescent green protein that gets activated when they're touched. So in other words, they glow when touched.
Wow.
and he is looking at the ways that the signal of a touch to a plant travels through the whole plant body incredibly quickly. So he handed me a pair
Even
of
though they don't have a
tweezers.
nervous system like we think of a
Right.
mammalian nervous system.
Exactly. But they do have vasculature. They have a vein system. If you look at a plant, that mid-rib vein of a leaf filters down into the stem, and then there's veins like that on each of the leaves. And so I pinched this plant and watched this green glow move from the place that I had pinched it through the whole plant in something like 2 minutes. And so for me, I had been researching plant behavior research for a couple of years at that point, but almost everything I was learning was invisible to me, very intangible. You can't watch a plant communicate, for example, or manipulate an insect. But I was watching that plant activate its vein system to alert itself to what was essentially this assault with these tweezers. And this is provoking this new question in botany, but also it's filtering out into neurobiology as to whether or not plants might be considered to have nervous systems, whether nervous systems might be something more fundamental to all life, and may have evolved multiple times in different forms of life, the way that wings or eyesight evolved many times separately.
Yeah, you explain, I think, the way that octopods have such a distinct nervous system compared to the centralized brain structure, and how that might open up our conceptions to make us more, I guess, susceptible to understanding plant nervous systems.
I think it's really interesting to think about the ways that octopuses have been understood to be potentially conscious just in the last few years, because they have brains, so they're more legible to us, and faces, legible to us than plants, let's say. But at the same time, they have neurons distributed throughout their limbs, so their processing and their sensing is diffuse in a way that is somewhat analogous to how we might understand plant sensing, in the sense that plants don't have a centralized nervous system, but they have diffuse coordinated sensing. And so we've been able to look at octopuses now and understand them as intelligent despite their sensing capacity being so different than our own. And instead of that difference being something that lowers them in our mind, it's actually elevated to our status. And I think that that's an interesting conceptual frame to start thinking about how we might imagine plants to be intelligent.
And plants sense touch or wind or attack, and of course, for a reason, in that it's part of the way that they can respond actively to help themselves survive. But some of it was quite surprising to me, the way that plants, for example, physically strengthen themselves in response to...
Yes, there's a series of plant touch experiments done in the 70s where a researcher sort of touched plants over and over again to see what they would do, and a lot of them, these are very common crop plants, would harden their stems, thicken their stems, subdue their growth, and sort of become sturdier in response to constantly being pestered. And that was the kind of first moment where science was turning to this idea that actually maybe plants do change their bodies constantly in response to what's going on in their environment. And it makes sense. I mean, they evolved rooted in place. And so if you don't have the capacity to get up and move around, you better have a really good idea of what's going on and how to protect yourself from it. So, you know, not only does a plant sense touch, but when it senses that touch, it activates its immune system. It prepares itself to better withstand whatever's about to happen to it.
And, okay, so wind might provoke one reaction to, you know, moving energy from growth to fortification. What about touch that's hostile?
Right. So, I mean, one hostile touch would be like a caterpillar chewing a leaf. There are a number of plants that have been researched that are able to sense the regurgitant and saliva that the caterpillar leaves behind and take that information and understand what chemical they need to synthesize to summon the predator of that caterpillar. So a tomato plant, for example, is able to summon the exact parasitic wasp that wants to come and inject its eggs into the caterpillar body.
By releasing a chemical that's attractive to the wasp.
Exactly. So plants are geniuses at chemical synthesis. they manufacture these compounds that are exactly suited to the conditions that they're finding themselves in. And they release them through these pores on their leaves called stomata. And the stomata look like little fish lips under a microscope.
Those are the ones that also take in the carbon dioxide?
Exactly,
Right.
and release the oxygen. These are their breathing apparatus in some
Right.
kind of way. So in a way, they exhale these compounds and they float on the air. And in this case, we're talking about an attractant for a parasitic wasp that they've made. And the wasp senses that and arrives to the tomato and finds these perfect caterpillar substrates for their eggs and injects their eggs into them. And then the larvae hatch and eat the caterpillar from the inside out. Very
Bad
gnarly.
for the caterpillar, good for the plant.
Exactly. And that the plant is trying to save itself in that way.
So if a caterpillar might provoke a response that to us might seem like responding to pain or attack, of course, plants want a different sort of touch, most of all pollination.
Yeah.
How are they involved not just as passive deliverers of pollen, but as managers of pollinators?
In so many ways. There's a class of orchids, mostly in Australia, that are considered sexually deceptive orchids because they produce pheromones for wasps. Again, we're dealing, there's a certain numbers of bees, wasps, flies, that kind of a thing. And these are the wasps that pollinate them in this case. And so they're able to pump out the exact pheromone that tricks a male wasp into thinking it's approaching a female wasp, when instead it's being attracted by a flower. And the orchid has this slender sepal strand, this modified petal that has a bulb at the end of it that's roughly the size and shape of a female wasp. And so the male comes and grasps the bulb and bounces around on it, and then eventually smacks into the middle of the orchid, and the orchid glues a little sac of pollen to its back. It's very funny. Some species have this perfect yellow cube of pollen ready to just glue on the back of a
Wow.
wasp. And then the wasp goes off, is presumably attracted by another orchid, and then that's how the orchid gets pollinated. So plants are in the business of modulating pollination all the time, kind of conscripting insects to do their bidding in this way. And plant reproduction is highly selective and involved.
Even though this is mind-blowing, it makes some sense that plants would be responsive to physical stimuli. I was even more surprised the extent to which they are engaged in the world of sound.
Yes.
Can plants hear?
If we put big air quotes around the word hear,
Uh-huh.
I'm perfectly comfortable saying they can. Like you said, physical stimulus is what they're responding to. And for plants...
Which sound is too.
Exactly.
Disturbances in the air.
Sound is pure vibration to plants. That's a physical stimulus. And plants are incredibly sensitive to those vibrations. The world of phytoacoustics is a discipline that's sort of being birthed now and has not been around that long, but is producing a lot of interesting results. One of which is that roots are able to be attracted to the sound of running water in sealed pipes. So they have no, we already know roots are all about moisture gradients. They can sense moisture in the soil, but even in the absence of
Any actual moisture.
Exactly, they can direct themselves towards the sound of the water.
They also manipulate sound. I mean, I was also impressed by the ways that they interact with bats, for example.
Yes. So there are, I believe, 2 at the moment known vines, both in Latin American rainforests, that have specially modified parts to their bodies that are designed specifically to be bat sonar reflectors. There's one vine that creates this canoe-like upright leaf that perfectly reflects bat sonar from many angles of incidence. And you can imagine if you're a bat and you are flying at very high speed through a very complicated forest with a lot of objects, a lot of vines and trees and plants in your way, this sonar reflector would stand out. And that's how these bat-pollinated vines attract bats to them. Another species that's similar to this has little sonar mirrors in front of each of its flowers, so it's sort of ringed in many flowers. And let's say one of these flowers attracts a bat, that mirror will actually put itself down after that flower has already been
Because
visited.
its work is done.
Its work is done, and it wants the bat to go to a different flower now.
Wow.
So even in their physiology, plants are engaging in the world of sound.
The coevolution of plants with so many different types of species is a whole field in itself, but I was wondering if you might share some of the way that plants in Hawaii in particular, native and endemic plants, evolved with birds and so on, since Hawaii was and is the world's most isolated archipelago, so it's a kind of little experimental zone in plant and bird coevolution.
Hawaii is such an interesting case because, first of all, as everyone here probably is very aware, everything that arrived here in incredible circumstances, like a seed floating on the ocean or coming in the belly of a bird. And so when a species arrived here, it speciated out into all of these versions of itself that are so specific. And it also did this in the absence of predators. So there weren't really any predators to plants. And so every plant on Hawaii is sort of this fabulous example of what plant life would look like if it was allowed to evolve under no threats at all.
In Plant Utopia.
Plant Utopia. This is definitely heaven for plants, or it was at least.
Yeah.
So you end up with things like mint that has no mint oil. So everything in the Erica family here, mint family, you crush it, doesn't smell like a mint, because mint oil is a defensive compound. You don't need the defensive compound if there's nothing that's going to eat you. But it also means that there's these incredibly adapted interrelationships. For example, the honey creeper bird and the many tubular flowers that are exactly shaped to fit the very long beak of the honey creeper. There's a plant that I now believe is almost extinct on Kauai, but is now grown as a houseplant in greenhouses all over the world, thanks to some incredible work by plant conservationists on Kauai, called the Vulcan palm, or cabbage on a stick. And it was pollinated only by something called the fabulous green sphinx moth, which is the real name of that moth. And
that's a great name.
It's a great name. But it also means that each of these species are extremely vulnerable, which is part of why you see so many extinctions and so many rare plants on the islands, is that they don't have these defenses. So, for example, the Vulcan palm has been almost entirely eradicated by introduced animals that just eat it. It's just like it's like a cabbage on a stick. It's just a treat.
In addition to plants being, I'm going to keep walking us through the senses because I think it's amazing. But in addition to being responsive to touch and sound, there are ways that plants, it seems, respond to light in a way that's like seeing. Of course, we know plants are responsive to light. That's their big thing, photosynthesizing.
Yeah.
But tell us about these plants that engage in kind of mimicry that suggests in some way they are apprehending the world in ways we didn't expect.
Right. So there is this one vine that is currently blowing botanists' minds. They have yet not found any way to explain what it's doing, but it's a vine that grows in southern Chile in this temperate rainforest, and it is able to spontaneously mimic whatever it's growing beside, which means that it'll have a standard shape, the shape it sort of takes when it's by itself. And then I went to see it, so you can see a plant winding. It's called Bocchilla trifoliolata, and when Bocchilla is sort of growing out of the ground, the leaves towards its base will be this normal, very standard three-leafed shape, quite boring looking, and it will get entwined into a bush or veer near a tree, and the leaves closest to that bush, that tree, that other plant will completely change their shape to match those of the thing they're growing beside. And I mean, it's not just shape. They are able to change the thickness of their leaves, the texture, whether or not they're glossy, the color, the vein pattern, to match whatever they're growing beside. And why this is amazing is that it's spontaneous. They can now mimic, I think they've been found to mimic something like 25 species in that rainforest, including species that had only been introduced in the last 10, 15 years.
And what's the advantage of
Well,
mimicry for a
there's
plant?
been one paper, this is very, very recent work, but there's been one paper that's found It protects them from herbivory. They are able to camouflage. Sort of, if you melt into the background and look like everything around you, you are statistically less likely to be the one that gets eaten.
Oh, okay.
Eaten. So it's defensive, and it makes sense. But there's now kind of two camps of botanists, one of whom believes this means plants can see, that they are taking what we believe, or what looks logically to our minds like visual information, what another plant looks like, and translating it into their physical form. And that's a very provocative idea, because plants, they don't have any brains. And so for us...
Or eyes.
Or eyes.
I mean, I guess they have photosensing.
They have photoreceptors. They have a lot of photoreceptors. They have more photoreceptors in their leaves than we have in our eyes, which is how they're able to do things like sense whether they're being shaded by a cloud or by another plant. They can sense whether or not...
To grow out of that shadow.
Exactly. I mean, but it's more complicated than that. They can sense whether or not they're being shaded by their genetic sibling or not, based on the quality of the light passing through a leaf. So very fine-tuned sensing.
Wow.
But they have no place to translate visual information or light patterns into an image. Like our brains are responsible for that image. So how they would translate the leaf, the whole look of a leaf, into action is still a complete mystery.
And is there a counter theory too that they're somehow gathering genetic information from the rival plants?
Right. So actually the scientist who discovered this capacity, Ernesto Giannoli, his theory is that it doesn't make sense to say plants can see. He really doesn't like that theory. His theory is that this is a sort of microbial invasion, that all plants have a sort of microbiome, a microbial cloud around them, as do we. And that we're just learning now that microbes are responsible for augmenting our gene expression. Quite a bit of our gene expression is augmented by microbes, as is true for plants. And so he thinks that maybe Bokila is just very open to the microbial cloud of other plants, very porous in a way, in a genetic sense, and is taking on those microbes and allowing them to manipulate its shape. So more like a virus or fungal infection than visual sight.
But the jury out, or the
I
peer
think
review.
we'll be very lucky if we get an answer in the next 5-10 years.
Right. You also survey a larger and kind of more established, I guess now, body of work on the way plants communicate with one another, which I also found amazing. And I wonder if you might kind of explain the ways that plants broadcast warnings to one another, maybe distinct warnings to their closest relatives, to others.
Yes. So again, going back to this incredible capacity to produce synthetic chemicals, to synthesize compounds that plants have. One of the main ways we understand plant communication is for warning other plants in the area that there's an attack going on, that there's a bunch of pests eating them, that they should boost their immune system in response. But there's been work done on sagebrush that has found that plants are also able to modify those warning signals to be decipherable only by their kin in certain circumstances, and by all the plants in the area in others, which is something that we know about from animal behavior. Songbirds, or birds in general, are known to send warning calls, have warning calls that are only for their family group sometimes, and for everyone in the area at other times. And this has been described to me by researchers as a bit like if you're in a theater and someone shouts fire in German, but you don't speak German, you will still understand something's wrong and you have to think about it and do something about it.
Right.
But if someone stands up and gives a monologue in German and you don't speak German, that's not meant for you. You're not going to be able to understand it. So plants are able to adjust their sentences, their syntax, chemically speaking, to direct it to different groups.
And sometimes it's an advantage to, under modest attack, I suppose, to only try to boost the immune system of your closest relatives to propagate your species. But in other cases, I guess if it's a really severe threat, it's better if all of the plants are working together to fend off whatever is
Exactly.
whatever locusts are descending.
Thank you. That is the part of this I just didn't mention.
Okay.
But yes, it has to do with how intense the attack is and how common it is to be attacked. There's a sort of impulse to save your genetic group, your family group, when attacks are rare. But when attacks are frequent, often, there's a genetic advantage seen to preserving everybody in the area. And so that's when warning calls get broadcast more widely.
So might plants be, you said that warnings are the most known ways that plants are communicating with one another.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that we also know that in some cases plants are communicating with animals.
Mm-hmm.
But might there be other sorts of information that's being transmitted in plant language?
There's a lot of manipulation happening through communication. You mentioned this communication with animals. Often plants are able to send deceptive signals to animals. I'm really interested in the case of the yellow monkey flower, which I've seen growing wild in California. Yellow monkey flowers emit some kind of chemical when there's lots of pollen there. And bees have a sort of pre-screening process. So bees are their pollinators, and the bees will be flying over an area of yellow monkey flowers and pick up on the signal that a flower has lots of pollen in it, and it'll be attracted to that one. But somehow the monkey flower has understood the rules of that game and understood the pre-screening process enough to figure out how to emit that chemical without even making the pollen, because it's very expensive to make pollen for a plant, energetically expensive. And so it'll sort of do a bait and switch with this bee. The bee will assume that there's pollen there because of the chemical it's sensing. It'll arrive to nothing, and the plant will get pollinated anyway.
Wow. We're sort of going through all of these senses that are so similar to ours that we're working toward understanding plants as being so much more active than is traditionally conceived when we talk about, vegetables as the way we work plants into language. Often they're signals for boredom or for or lack of movement.
Yeah.
But the one that I don't know, all of these areas there were elements of these studies that surprised me. But the possibility that plants are remembering without neurological structures that we think of as anything akin to animal brains. What evidence do we have that plants are able to encounter something that happens in the world and maintain knowledge of that?
The world of plant memory research is really interesting. Plants have various forms of memory. One that's most basic and maybe most familiar to people is the memory of passing seasons and time, in the sense that, in places that have distinct cold seasons, most fruit trees require an elapsed period of cold in the winter in order for them to bloom in the spring. It's called the memory of winter. And that presumes the plant is doing some counting of days of cold and storing that information. It also counts days of warmth to avoid emerging in a freak warm spell. So that's some very basic memory we can think about plants. But then there's more sophisticated memory that's coming to light now, including this plant in the Andes, grows way up high in the Peruvian Andes, and it's an incredible star-shaped flower called Nasa poisaniana, and it keeps its pollen on the tips of its stamen, sort of laying down in each petal to sort of protect it from the elements. And it will raise these stamen very quickly. You can watch it. I saw it in a greenhouse in Bonn, watching them do this. It happens within the course of a minute or two, which is very fast for a plant. Researchers have recently discovered it will do this because it's recording the time interval between pollinator visits. So it will time this pollen presentation according to the schedule of when it expects a pollinator to arrive. And it will change that time interval if the pollinator visitation schedule changes. And it does this because there's not a lot of pollinators up there.
Right.
They have to make every single shot count. And so this is a form of counting and memory and adjusting when the circumstances change. But these are all short-term memory. but we still don't know where they store any of these memories.
Well, but long-term in terms of seasonal.
And long-term in terms of seasonal. And then there's another sort of embodied memory that you can think about in a basic way with plants, which is that plants are allocating resources in their own bodies all the time. If you look up at a tree and you see a single bare branch somewhere on that tree, but other branches have leaves on them, so clearly this plant is flourishing, this tree is alive. That bare branch is the memory, in a way, of a place where there used to be sunlight, where it used to be worth it for that plant to produce leaves to catch photons from the sun, to photosynthesize. But the plant is constantly keeping track of where it's photosynthesizing, and eventually that branch clearly got shaded out. So it redirected resources, sort of cut that branch off from resources so it no longer produces leaves, and redirected elsewhere. And so in a way, the entire plant is a sort of embodied memory of everything that's happened in its life.
Yeah, and in that sense, in a way, it's making decisions, exhibiting behaviors, as it were. One of the behaviors that especially struck me was the way that plants, in a certain sense, tend their offspring, not just in kind of all of the ways that you've described, that they're trying to increase their chance of pollination and reproduction, which are better known. But I wonder if you might talk about plants as parents.
Yes. So there's a whole realm in botany called maternal care in plants, which is so interesting to me because most plants are actually bisexual, meaning they have both male and female parts in the same plant. So they go through sort of a paternal phase and a maternal phase. But maternal care in plants is about how plants will finally adjust things like the thickness of the seeds they produce. Because, let's say, there's not much moisture in the area. So that seed needs maybe a thinner coat protecting it so that it can take in moisture as a seed. Or there's too much moisture, so they make a thicker coat for the seed.
Wow.
There's other examples, for example, like plants that grow a spike and have the seeds along the spike. Often this is a very exposed part of a plant. And if there's a ton of sunlight in the area, those seeds risk getting scorched. And so the plant will change the colors from the black area of the gradient to the white area of the gradient to absorb more or less solar energy to better preserve those seeds.
Wow.
And so they're just trying to set up their plant offspring for the best possible success.
But there was one plant that is kind of a farmer, like planting its seeds in specific locations.
Yeah. Yes.
Tell that one.
Okay.
It's a compendium of amazing stories.
So many fun facts. So
it is.
The plant I was thinking about this with in the book is in Brazil, but maybe an easier plant to think about this with is peanuts actually do this.
Oh.
Just regular old peanuts will bend over in growth. They sort of grow their seeds on the end of a stem where their flower once was. And when it's time for that seed to be in the ground, that branch will literally bend down and plant that seed in the ground.
Does it seem to choose an ideal location in some way?
Well, in a sense, yes, because it was the location that the parent was successful in.
Okay.
So this maternal care, in a sense, is making sure, as opposed to just letting their seeds disperse on the wind or be carried in the belly of a bird to wherever, that plant knows that it grew up there, so it's probably a good place for its offspring to grow up, so they just plant them.
Well, there also might be, there are advantages in plant society too. Like, not only might it enhance the ability of that plant to survive if it's a good place, but it also means you've got kin around that might.
That's a good point, absolutely, because we know that
survive in some other way.
Exactly, that kin plants can sometimes be more cooperative than stranger plants.
All of these adaptations raise these provocative questions that could be metaphorical, they could be anthropomorphizing, and one of them is in the title of your book, which for some scientists is kind of a trigger word, intelligence. Why did you choose to lean into the concept of intelligence and consciousness? I'll start there.
Okay.
And then I want to ask you why it matters also.
Well, I think that, like you said, there's a lot of researchers very hesitant to use words like intelligence and consciousness for plants, and I fully understand that. Scientists are in the business of being precise, of not releasing something into the public imagination until they're quite sure that it's true. And the problem with the word intelligence and the word consciousness is that there is no settled scientific definition for either of those things. They seem so basic, and yet we don't really have any way to define them. I mean, consciousness is one of the hardest, mushiest words of all because we haven't understood the basis, the mechanical substrate for consciousness even in ourselves. That's still an open question. We can feel our own consciousness, but we can't verify it mechanically in any other organism, even another human. So there's a lot of scientists who are very resistant to draping these kind of human notions and these mushy words that can be interpreted widely on a whole nother taxa of life. Not because they don't think plants are doing incredible things,
right,
but because they don't think they deserve all this human weirdness put on them in a way. But I use them because I think that there is room for us to use our language and the limitations of our language to sort of expand our minds and accept the fact that, let's say, the word intelligence, having no definition, can be widely interpreted and should be allowed to expand to include other forms of intelligence, that we can have plant intelligence and for that to be completely distinct from sort of human, maybe academic intelligence or the ways we measure intelligence in ourselves. So in understanding that language is limited, and yet in understanding we need some bridges for understanding for ourselves.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like dealing with aliens. We're never going to come up with the perfect language that holds the right meaning for ourselves, besides the words we already have in use. So in a way, I use those words as a gesture of faith in the capacity for all of us to hold complexity in our minds, to not reduce plants to like little humanoid cartoon characters, but yet still recognize them as being a form of biological intelligence in the sense that everything that evolved biologically is capable of intense cleverness. Otherwise, it never would be here.
Right.
Survival is a form of plant intelligence.
But plant intelligence, I think, in consciousness has it's not only a way of kind of conceiving of complexity or distilling complicated, contradictory science, but there are kind of ethical and political implications too.
Yeah.
Maybe if we think of plants as beings that are parenting and remembering and communicating, maybe we're less likely to cut down trees to make toilet paper, or, I mean, is your hope that we might give plants greater philosophical and legal standing in the world, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that would be a really exciting outcome of this sort of revolution in plant sciences. I think it's very clear that when you regard something as intelligent or having a lifestyle or having a sort of will to live, it's harder to disrespect that thing. The awe that I now feel towards plants and the recognition of their intrinsic agency and sort of selfhood and self-determination leads away from any capacity for me to now exploit plants. Like, I feel very aware that, for example, they can feel my touch, that they have a sort of, they're bending towards survival always and doing ingenious things to ensure that, not just survival, even flourishing. You know, maternal care is an example of that. And when you recognize that in another being, it's just harder to disrespect them. And I think that it would put certain human behaviors into the realm of unacceptability. I mean, we are animals that need to eat plants. There's no way around that. We need them to make our clothes. We need them to build our houses.
And even paleo diets, you're still eating plants,
yeah,
just cycled through
exactly
ungulates.
Right.
Or
so
birds or something.
Every molecule of sugar that we've ever ingested has been recycled from a plant because they're the only ones that can make sugar out of non-living material. But I think recognizing that that's not a neutral thing is actually very good for us, kind of admitting a certain degree of acceptance of, in a way, the violence of our own needs to consume other life forms helps us kind of settle back into this idea of reciprocity, that maybe this is not something you can do without any consideration for where your sustenance is coming from.
This speaks too, I think, to a growing philosophical and scientific conversation about new, like, emerging scientific findings and how we reconcile that with ways of thinking or ideology in either the Western tradition or, increasingly looking to see how we might bring science and dialogue with indigenous epistemologies. And this research in particular seems to really lean more toward worldviews that conceive of plants, as Robin Kimmerer puts it, as relatives or distinct beings with their own intrinsic value. And I wonder if, to what extent did you dabble in or look into some specific examples of indigenous ways of conceiving of plants that seem more reconcilable with emerging science than the Western notions, traditional Western post-Enlightenment notions of dominion?
Yes, totally. I think what's really interesting about this moment is that you see kind of Western hard sciences coming closer and closer to things that indigenous scientists and indigenous cosmologies and knowledge systems have known for a very long time, which is that for those of us who have absorbed the Western European thought tradition, plants are somewhere at this bottom rung in this hierarchy of life, like maybe just above rocks, but below things like slugs. But in reading indigenous botanical texts, for example, this one book called Plants Have So Much to Give Us, All We Have to Do Is Ask, which is this group of Anishinaabe plant teachings. There's this amazing quote where the author is really acknowledging the fact that actually that hierarchy is literally, scientifically, biologically reversed in the sense that we are fully dependent on plants. And so this author is talking about how the forces of wind and rain and sun are sort of the elder brother in the life family, and animals are sort of, or plants, are second brothers in the sense that they are only dependent on these elements. They don't need anything else in the world to survive. And then you have animals as the third brothers. They're dependent on the plants and the sun and the wind. And then we're at the bottom there. We are the baby brothers. We are the most recently created of this chain of being, and we are dependent on every other category, each other brother, without really them needing us at all. So that's a real inversion that I think settles us back into a certain humbleness and an absolutely scientifically indisputable place of total dependence, of being the most recent here and the least useful in a way.
Right. The least independent, at least.
The least
despite
independent.
How we might conceive of ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think it's also interesting to think about in many indigenous cosmologies, plants are ancestors, very literally. Like for the Maya, corn.
And in
people
Hawaii.
come from corn. I'd
With
love to
Kalo.
learn more about that. Okay, amazing. And that's also literally true. I mean, we did have a common ancestor. It's just really long time ago.
So you spoke at the beginning when we were talking that this project grew out of fatigue with the kind of relentless crisis topic of climate change. And so did it work? Did you find solace and hope in the world of plants that you might not have otherwise?
I am back to covering climate change.
So you're back to bleak?
I'm back to bleak. It hasn't gotten less bleak. I can't say learning about plants fixed that for me or gave me some sort of abundant sense that we were going to figure this out climate change-wise. But it did sort of re-enchant the world in certain ways. More importantly, as it pertains to climate change, it kind of connected me back to these material stakes of what we do stand to lose in climate change. It can be very easy to forget all of the life forms that are impacted by our actions that are not immediately useful to us. And so thinking about plants and their capacities reminded me that every single biological life form has a right to be here and is worth it just because they exist, because they are the last node in this like continuous biological creativity process of evolution, and they are the most recent innovation of evolution, building on millions of years of tinkering, of fine-tuning, and that is worth protecting at all costs. And it's also a reminder that we are the same thing. We are each like this end of just a continual form of biological creativity. And so everything has as much a right to stay here as we do.
Yeah, and climate is such a huge problem that it needs many solutions, little fixes and giant ones, but maybe philosophical and ethical shifts as well. And I feel that too when reading your book. The way that it's making me reconceive of and ask big questions about how we as a species live on this planet, breathing in the oxygen that they're giving us.
Totally, yeah.
So thank you for this work. Thank you for coming to visit us. And we look forward to speaking with you more and hearing more about your climate work and whatever comes next.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
And thanks to our sponsors, thanks to our students and staff who make all of this possible, and thanks to all of you for listening. Aloha.
Thank you.